The envelope was sitting on my doormat at 7 in the morning. White and plain, no return address, just my name written in handwriting I did not recognize. I almost stepped over it. I had been stepping over things for months: bills, notices, the small pile of worry that collects when you are a woman living alone, and the math stops adding up somewhere around the 15th of every month. But I picked it up, and everything I thought I understood about the last 6 months rearranged itself in the time it took me to read one page. I want to tell you the whole story from the beginning because the beginning matters. It always does. I moved into apartment 4C on a Tuesday in March with 2 suitcases, a box of kitchen things, and exactly $1,100 left in my checking account after the deposit. The building was old, the kind of place where the elevator worked about 2/3 of the time, and the radiator knocked against the wall at 3 in the morning like somebody was trying to get your attention. The hallways smelled like other people's cooking. The windows in my unit were single pane and let in the cold along the edges. I knew all of this when I signed the lease. I signed it anyway because the rent was the only number in the whole city that did not make me feel physically ill. My name is Kara. I was 31 years old. I had a job as an office coordinator at a mid-sized printing company that had been slowly shedding people for about a year, and I was doing the mental arithmetic every thinking person in a shrinking company does, wondering how many more rounds before the math got personal. It got personal in October. They called 4 of us in one Friday afternoon, gave us our letters and a box each, and walked us to the lobby with the kind of polite efficiency that is somehow worse than anger. I cried in the parking garage. Then I went home and made a spreadsheet. That is who I am. When I get scared, I open a spreadsheet and I look at the numbers until they stop feeling like an attack. The numbers were not encouraging. My savings would cover 3 months of rent if I was careful. For if I ate nothing interesting and stopped pretending I had a social life. I applied for everything I was remotely qualified for, and some things I was not. I picked up freelance work formatting documents for a small nonprofit that paid me in checks that always arrived a week later than they said they would.
I sold some things.
Not anything important, just the things you acquire during your 20s that feel meaningful at the time and turn out to be perfectly sellable later. A record player. A painting I had paid too much for. A set of luggage I had bought optimistically before realizing I could not afford to go anywhere. By December, I had burned through more than I planned. I was still applying, still formatting documents for the nonprofit, still doing that particular kind of calculation where you know the answer before you finish the math and you run it again anyway hoping the numbers will change. January rent was due on the 1st. I had half of it. I know how that sounds. I know people read sentences like that and immediately start cataloging the choices that led there, the places where a smarter woman would have saved more or borrowed sooner or taken a different path back somewhere. I cataloged all of those myself. I was very thorough about it. But here is the thing nobody tells you about losing a job after 30, after you have built a life around a certain income and a certain set of assumptions. It does not feel dramatic when it happens. It feels like standing in a room where the floor is slowly tilting and you keep adjusting your weight trying to stay upright, and by the time you admit you are falling, you're already much closer to the ground than you thought. I went to my landlord on December 30th. His name was Mr. Aldine. He was a man in his 60s with a gray cardigan he always seemed to be wearing and reading glasses pushed up on his head even when he was not reading anything. He managed the building himself. He had lived on the ground floor for as long as the building had been his, which was longer than I had been alive. I knocked on his door and told him the truth because I could not think of a better option. He listened without interrupting. That was the first thing I noticed. I had prepared for the interruption for the sorry, but this is a business conversation. The here is the late fee policy speech. Instead, he just let me finish. When I did, he looked at his glasses for a second. Then he said, "Give me a few days." I did not know what that meant. I went back upstairs and lay on my couch and stared at the ceiling and thought about whether I could ask my sister for money and decided I could not, at least not yet, and thought about the thing that scared me most, which was not being homeless, but being a person who needed saving in a way that everyone could see. On January 2nd, he knocked on my door. He told me the January rent had been covered. I stared at him. By who? He shook his head once. Said he had been asked to keep that private. Said the person who paid wanted it that way, and he had agreed. I stood in my doorway trying to understand what was happening. Someone paid my rent. Someone I did not know paid my rent and did not want me to know who they were. I asked him if it was a mistake, some kind of building fund or assistance program I had not applied for. He said it was not. He said someone had come to him directly and paid in full and asked him to say nothing beyond the fact that it was handled. I said thank you, which felt completely insufficient, and he nodded and went back downstairs. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that. The feeling was not relief, at least not right away. It was something closer to dislocation. Like someone had reached into the story I was living and changed a chapter without asking me, and I was still catching up to the new version. I kept trying to think who it could be. I made a mental list. My sister lived 2 states away and barely had spare money of her own. My parents were both gone. I had friends, but not the kind of friendships where people quietly paid your rent for you. Those were work friendships mostly, the kind that are real inside the building and get thinner the farther you get from the lobby. I had dated someone for 2 years who had ended things the previous spring, and it was not the kind of ending that led to acts of secret generosity. I could not make it add up no matter how many times I tried. February came. I had picked up a part-time position doing admin work for a real estate office, not much, but enough to buy groceries and pay my utilities and feel less like I was in freefall. I went to Mr. Aldine on February 1st with $300, which was what I had after the essentials, and told him I could pay partial and would have the rest within 2 weeks. He looked at the cash. Then he told me February had already been paid. Again, I felt something complicated move through me. Gratitude was part of it. So was something that felt uncomfortably like shame. Even though I knew that was not fair, shame did not care what was fair. And underneath both of those things was a kind of urgent need to know who was doing this. Not to stop them necessarily, just to be able to look at the situation clearly and understand it. I asked him again. He said he had promised. That was the whole answer. He had promised, and he was keeping it. I started paying attention to everyone in the building differently after that. Watching without meaning to. We had 11 units in 4C, 12 counting the ground floor where Mr. Aldine lived. I had spoken to most of my neighbors in the way you speak to people you share walls with. Brief conversations in the hallway, the elevator when it worked, near the mailboxes. Nods and small weather observations, and the occasional comment about the noise from the unit above mine, where someone lifted weights at 6 in the morning with a level of commitment I could only respect from a distance. There was a retired teacher named Mrs. Fontaine in 4A who grew herbs on her windowsill and sometimes left a bunch of them tied outside your door with no explanation, just rosemary or thyme sitting there like a question. There was a man in 3B named Theo who worked nights somewhere and was always coming in just as I was going out, half asleep, smelling like industrial something, always polite but always moving too fast to stop. There was a young couple in 2C who fought in bursts and made up loudly and had a dog named something I could never quite catch that scratched at the bottom of their door when it heard the elevator. And there was the man in 4B. His name was David. I knew that because it was on his mailbox below mine, and because once a package of his had been delivered to my door and I had knocked on his to hand it over. He was in his mid-40s, I guessed, quiet the way some people are, quietly by design rather than by accident. Not unfriendly. Careful might be the better word. He said thank you for the package in a way that was genuine but did not extend an invitation to keep talking, and I had not pressed. I did not add him to my list at first. He did not feel like a person who did dramatic things in secret. He felt like a person who kept mostly to himself and liked it that way. March was paid. April was paid. By May I had a full-time position. A proper one, benefits and all, as an operations coordinator for a company that made educational software. The pay was better than the printing company had been. I was stable again, or becoming stable, the kind of slowly solidifying feeling when you realize the floor has stopped tilting. I went to Mr. Aldine and said I could pay my own rent now, all of it, from that month forward. I also said I wanted to pay back whatever I owed from the months someone had covered. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told me the person who had paid had specifically said there was nothing to pay back. I stood there in his hallway with my hands feeling useless at my sides. There is no clean way to describe what that does to you. Being helped in that magnitude, help you did not ask for and cannot return, by someone who will not even let you acknowledge it. It sits in you in a complicated way. It is not a comfortable feeling even when it is a good one. I asked him one more time to tell me. I said I understood if he could not. I said I just needed to know so I could at least say thank you like a person and not walk around feeling like someone else was carrying something I could not see. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, that person will make themselves known when they feel ready. And that was all he would give me. May I paid myself. June, I paid myself. I started to think, maybe, I would never know, that whoever it was had chosen their distance deliberately, and the most decent thing I could do was accept that and move forward and try to hold on to the feeling of what it meant to be caught by someone when you were falling, even a stranger, even without a name to put to it. And then one morning in late July, the envelope was on my mat. I brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a second before I opened it. The way you look at something when you sense it is about to change the shape of a story you have been living in. My name on the front in careful handwriting, the kind of handwriting that had been practiced rather than rushed. I opened it. The note was 2 pages, written on plain white paper, both sides of the first page and half of the second. Not a letter exactly. More like something someone had written, because it had gotten too heavy to keep carrying alone. It started with his name, David, the man from 4B. I sat down. I read it again from the beginning. He said he had moved into the building 3 years before me. He said he moved in 2 months after his wife died. That he had chosen the building because it was quiet and because he did not know anyone in this part of the city, and that anonymity had felt like something he needed at the time. He said the first year in that apartment he had barely functioned. That he worked from home doing accounting work, and some days the only reason he left the unit was to check the mail, and some days he did not do even that. He said he heard me move in on a Tuesday in March. Not because he was listening, he wrote, but because the walls were thin and moving and makes noise, and he had gotten good at knowing the shape of the building's sounds. He said he heard me, and his first feeling was irritation, not at me, just at the intrusion of another person existing nearby, when he was so deep inside his own quiet. But then he wrote about a night in early April. He said it was raining. He said he had not eaten anything that day and it was past 8 at night, and he knew the way you know things when you are not doing well that he had to eat something, but the idea of going out or ordering something felt like too many steps. He was standing in his kitchen, he wrote, unable to start anything, and then he heard a knock at his door. He opened it, and it was me. I was holding a pot. I sat very still when I read that. I remembered that night. I had made a chicken and rice thing, too much of it because I always made too much of something when I was stressed, and cooking was one of the things I did when I could not settle. I had thought about just putting the extra in containers, but somehow, I do not know why exactly, maybe because the hall smelled like nothing was cooking and there was something about that whole floor that felt like people eating alone. I had knocked on 4B because the light under the door suggested someone was home. He had opened the door, and I had said something like, I made way too much of this, do you want some? And he had looked at the pot, and then at me, and said yes in this careful way and taken it. I had handed him the pot, and said something about just leaving it outside my door whenever he was done with it, and that was the whole exchange. It had taken maybe 45 seconds. I had not thought about it again after that. He thought about it for months. He wrote that it was not just the food, though the food helped in the particular way food helps when you have been neglecting yourself so long that you have stopped noticing the neglect. He wrote that it was the knock. The decision I had apparently made to act on a feeling instead of just walking past someone's door. He said he had been living in that building for 2 years by then, and no one had ever knocked on his door for something that was not building related. He said it made him realize how far inside himself he had gotten. He started eating again. Regularly. He started taking short walks in the evening. He said these things slowly, and without drama in the letter, the way you describe a recovery you're not sure you deserve credit for, just one thing after another, small. He wrote that he did not know what was happening with me until he heard me on the phone one evening in early December. The walls again, carrying sound the way thin walls do. He did not mean to listen, he wrote, but he heard enough. He heard me talking to someone, my sister I assumed later, about the job and the savings and the number that was not adding up anymore. He said he sat with it for a few days. He said he knew what it felt like to be in a place where the floor had shifted and you were trying not to let it show, and he knew from experience that the hardest thing was not the money itself, but the feeling that you were invisible in your difficulty, that the world was going on, and no one was adjusting for the fact that you were struggling to keep up. He did not want me to feel that. He wrote that he went to Mr. Aldine because he trusted him, because Mr. Aldine was the kind of man who kept things the way they needed to be kept. He paid January's rent in cash and asked him to say nothing specific, just that it was handled. He had not planned to keep going. That was what he wrote. He said he did January thinking it would give me time to land on my feet, and then he would leave it alone. But February came, and he was still hearing the sounds of someone trying to manage carefully, the lights going off early, the quiet that was a different kind of quiet than his own, and he paid February too. He paid it every month for 6 months. Not because he thought I could not recover, he wrote. He said he could tell from the sounds of the apartment that I was working that things were slowly improving, the light under my door burning later as months went on, the occasional voices of phone calls that sounded less tight and worried than the ones in December. He paid it because he did not want the ground to give way beneath me before I had found my footing again. Because somebody had once given him a pot of food on a rainy night when he could not remember how to start anything, and that small thing had mattered more than he had words for. He was not looking for anything in return. He wrote that very plainly. He did not want me to feel obligated or strange, or as though this was some arrangement with a cost I had not agreed to. He wrote that he was telling me now only because he was moving. A job had come up in another city, something in a university accounting department that had been passed to him through a former colleague, and he was leaving at the end of the month. He did not want to leave without me knowing, because knowing was something he thought I deserved. At the bottom of the second page, below his name, he had written one more line. It said, "The chicken and rice was very good, by the way. I have tried to make something similar twice and gotten it wrong both times." I put the letter down on the table and sat there for a very long time. There are things that happen to you that do not fit neatly into a category. They are not a love story, and they are not just a good deed, and they are not quite a friendship, though they are something in the neighborhood of all three. I had lived 11 feet away from this man for almost a year and a half. We had spoken maybe 4 times. He knew my name from the mailbox. I knew his the same way. And yet for 6 months, while I was trying to keep myself from going under, he was next door, quietly keeping the ground solid under my feet. I sat there and thought about that pot, about the way small things move through a life, about the fact that I had knocked on a stranger's door on a rainy night because something in me said it was the right thing to do and had not thought about it after, and that the same impulse had come back to me in the form of 6 months of rent paid in silence by a man who had been taught by his own grief that you could not always wait for the right words before you acted. I did not know if he was already gone. The letter had no date. I went to the hallway and knocked on 4B. He answered. He had a cardboard box in his arms, and there were more behind him near the window, taped and labeled. He looked at me and then at my face, and he knew I had read it. I want to be honest about what that moment was like. It was not smooth. Neither of us are the kind of people who move through moments like that gracefully. I said something completely inadequate about not knowing how to start this conversation, and he set the box down and said he had not known how to write the letter for about 4 months and had started it 3 separate times. I asked him why he finally sent it. He said because leaving without sending it would have felt like another version of going invisible, and he had been invisible for long enough to know he did not want to keep choosing it. We stood in his doorway for probably 20 minutes talking. Not about the money specifically. That part of the conversation was short because he would not let it be long. He kept redirecting it the way you redirect something that is making someone uncomfortable even when you are the one being thanked. We talked about the building, about Mr. Aldine and his cardigan, about the radiator, and the way the elevator always sounded like it was reconsidering. We talked about his wife a little, briefly, in the careful way he did things. He said her name was June, and that she had been the kind of person who knocked on doors without overthinking it, and that I had reminded him of that on the night in April, and that it had done more for him than a pot of food, though the food also genuinely helped. Before I left, I asked if I could write to him. Not email, just write. He seemed like someone who would prefer an actual letter.
He said yes.
He gave me an address in careful handwriting on a torn piece of notebook paper, the same handwriting from the envelope on my mat. I told him I was going to figure out the chicken and rice thing if it took me all year, and send him the recipe when I did. He almost smiled. He said, I would appreciate that. I went back to my apartment and stood in the kitchen and looked at the window, at the pale morning coming in around the edges of the old single-pane glass. Outside, the city was doing what cities do, moving and loud, and completely indifferent to the fact that something inside one old building on a quiet street had just shifted into a different shape. I thought about knocking on a door on a rainy night, about how that had felt like nothing at the time, 45 seconds and a two-full pot, and a small impulse I had not examined too closely. I thought about the months I had spent feeling like I was invisible in my struggle, like the world was continuing past me while I tried to get my footing back. And then about a man next door who had seen it, quietly, and without asking permission to help, and had simply made sure the floor held. You hear a lot about the big gestures. The ones with speeches attached, the ones people can see and comment on and call heroic. You hear less about the quiet ones. The ones where somebody makes a decision in private and follows through on it for 6 months without needing anyone to know. The ones that cost something real, not just money but attention and intention and the specific kind of courage it takes to act on a feeling for someone who cannot give you anything back. I do not have a clean ending to give you. He moved at the end of the month. Mr. Aldine helped him carry boxes down the elevator that was actually working that day, which felt like the building doing something decent for once. I watched from the hallway, and we said goodbye in the same careful way he did everything. He shook my hand, and I held it a second too long, and neither of us said anything too meaningful, because neither of us are built for that. The apartment next door is quiet now. Quieter than before. I have been working on the chicken and rice. I have made it 4 times. The 3rd time was close. I wrote him a letter last week with my adjustments, 2 pages, careful handwriting that I practiced more than I want to admit. I told him about the new job, about the way the city looks different when you are not looking at it through the lens of survival, about the way I think about small acts differently now, about what it means to knock on a door without knowing what it will start. At the bottom of the 2nd page I wrote, "Still getting the seasoning wrong, but I am not giving up on it." I have not heard back yet. I think he is the kind of person who takes his time with things that matter. I think that is a good quality. I think about the envelope on my doormat most mornings when I make coffee, about the handwriting I did not recognize and how close I came to stepping over it, about the 6 months someone spent quietly keeping the ground under me solid while I found my way back to standing on it. I knocked on a door on a rainy night. He paid a debt I did not know I had started collecting. I hope wherever he is, the walls are thinner than he expects. I hope someone knocks.